This content is going to be about my thoughts and observations on the Phoenix Arms HP22A. It's going to include but not be limited to detailing the safety modifications that I've done to this firearm, the takedown method that I prefer to use when I disassemble this gun. I'll also be discussing the ammo that I think runs best through this pistol. Then I'm going to offer some advice to avoid some of the most common issues with the HP22A. I'll be talking about the accessories that I purchased. Then finally I'll be comparing the wear on this 1050 round firearm to some of the brand new unused parts that I got from Phoenix Arms. Just a little side note before I get started. I know the price point on this gun makes it very attractive to anybody looking for a budget .22 pistol. But if you're a novice to firearms, this might not be the best option for you. I think to make this firearm a viable choice, internal modifications need to be done to give it a more common manual of arms. And over time, major parts in this gun will wear, and the ability to replace these parts will be necessary. Alright, with that being said, I'm going to show you the two safety modifications that I've done to this pistol. The first one being the removal of the small piece of metal that slides in behind the mag release when the grip safety is in the fire position. Removing this will allow you to drop the mag while that safety selector is in the fire position. This will also affect the way you can disassemble this pistol, which I'll be showing shortly. The second safety modification that I've done to this firearm was to alter the safety block bar. The job of the safety block bar is to keep your grip mounted safety from being put on fire without a magazine in the gun. So by bending this bar outward, it accomplishes two different things. First, you can drop your mag and clear a live round out of the chamber. And second, it helps your mags drop free. I will have to warn you though that if you cut this or take it out completely, it will void your warranty. While I'm on the subject of safeties and before I move forward, I'd just like to mention that I did come across some research that suggested that the slide mounted safety could possibly become so loose that it actually falls into the safe position and prevents you from firing. This has not become an issue for me, and I think if it ever did, my answer would be to use a automatic center punch and displace some material underneath the safety while it's in the fire position and essentially stake it in place. The next thing I'm going to do is detail the method that I like to use when I field strip this firearm. I've seen it done a few ways, and this is the way that I found most intuitive. First and foremost, always safety check your weapon. After that, you can cock the hammer back, followed by locking the slide to the rear. Doing this is going to make your takedown lever very tight, so what I like to do is maneuver the gun so that it's barrel down on the workbench. Then I'll have both of my hands on either side of the gun pushing forward on the lever with both of my thumbs. This will make the barrel loose. Then you can remove the barrel. After that, you can put your finger on top of the recoil spring while releasing the slide. While the slide's coming forward, lift up on the rear of the slide a little bit and the entire slide will come completely off the gun. After that, you can remove the recoil spring and the takedown lever. Reassembling this firearm, there's really only one thing to keep in mind, and that is that the manufacturer requires that the front of the recoil spring be at the 12 o'clock position to avoid any kind of possible damage. The way that I like to reassemble this pistol is to reinstall the recoil takedown lever assembly. Then I will place my index finger over the slide to control the recoil spring, and then using the front of the slide and the front of the frame as a reference point, I'll seat the slide past the ejector. Then I will lock the slide to the rear, double checking the spring, install the barrel by snapping it into place. Then I will release the slide, and then I'll do a controlled release of the hammer. Before taking this gun to the range for the first time, the only thing that I did to it was disassemble it, cleaned and lubricated it, and polished the feed ramp. During that trip, I put 380 rounds through this pistol with absolutely zero issues. This gun was an absolute blast to shoot. Typically my first range trip is all about the functionality of the firearm. I tend not to modify a gun until I'm sure it runs properly. After putting 380 rounds down range without any issues, I felt confident enough to implement the safety modifications. I added some red paint to both the safety selectors and the front sight, installed a Hogue Handall Junior grip sleeve, purchased a couple extended grip magazines, and I also purchased a Kydex holster for this pistol. The next thing I'm going to do is discuss the most common problems and complaints about this firearm and what I've done to remedy these issues. I've already discussed the most popular complaint about this pistol, which is the redundant safeties. The second one I'm going to talk about is the premature wear on the parts due to improper hardening or just the fact that they use cheap materials during the manufacturing. When I originally bought this gun, I actually bought some extra parts for it in anticipation of replacement. The one nice thing about this company is that the parts for this gun are extremely cheap, and you can purchase just about anything for this gun without being an FFL or a gunsmith. I'm going to take a few minutes here to go over the individual parts that I purchased and maybe offer some insight on how to make your parts last a little longer. The first extra parts that I purchased for this firearm were the 5-inch barrel and some extra recoil springs. Obviously with the barrel I was trying to get some extra accuracy out of this pistol, but the recoil springs on the other hand, I think they should be replaced every 1,000 rounds. I'll explain why I think this a little bit later. The next set of parts that I purchased were an extra hammer and strut spring. I've seen some research that suggested that after prolonged use of this gun, a divot can be formed in the face of your hammer that after around 3,000 rounds or so can cause light primer strikes. And I bought the strut spring thinking that if I had to hammer out, I might as well replace that while everything's disassembled. I also purchased an extra extractor and extractor spring. And the final set of parts that I purchased was a firing pin and firing pin spring. And the reason for that was the fact that this thing doesn't have a last round hold open, so the tendency to dry fire this gun after every magazine is very high. Which leads me to the third complaint that I'm going to discuss about this firearm, and that is that it has no last round hold open. There are a few things that you can do to help this situation. Obviously the first one is to count your rounds every time you're firing, but sometimes that goes south and it doesn't always work out. The second thing that you can do is modify the follower in your magazines using a panhead screw. There's a gentleman online that demonstrates how to do this. The only problem that I have with this is that it detracts from the capacity of your magazines. You go from 10 to 9. What I personally like to do is load a subsonic round into my magazines first. I usually use a CCI 720 foot per second quiet round. And what this will do is it'll give you an audible notification of when you're on your last round. You'll definitely hear that it sounds different when you fire that round. And then that round won't have enough energy to extract your spent case. So if you do dry fire your gun, it won't be falling on an empty chamber. The last issue that I'm going to talk about is the fact that some people have been reporting that their frames have been cracking on these guns. Earlier I said I'd explain why I thought the recoil springs needed replaced in this firearm every 1,000 rounds, and this is the issue that I had in mind. I've seen plenty of videos where people are firing this gun with high velocity ammo and not having any issues at all. But I also think those same people probably have a very fresh recoil spring or new recoil spring in their gun, and it's actually doing its job. I think the frames are cracking on these guns when they're firing high velocity ammo in conjunction with a recoil spring that probably needs replaced. The job of a recoil spring is not only to put your slide back in the battery, but it also slows down the rearward momentum of the slide while it's in motion. So if you're someone that's shooting high velocity rounds through this pistol, it's even more important for you to be replacing your recoil spring every 1,000 rounds, if not sooner. After painting my safety selectors and front sight, installing my grip sleeve, implementing the safety modifications, and using the subsonic ammo method of loading my magazines, I took this pistol out for its second range trip and proceeded to put 670 rounds downrange. The ammo that I took for this range trip was a combination of CCI standard velocity 1070 foot per second rounds and Aguila standard 1130 foot per second rounds. I quickly realized that the 50 foot per second difference in these two rounds created a significant performance issue in this firearm. I had 5 magazines with me, so I was running roughly about 45 rounds at a time, and with the CCI I was getting 3 to 4 malfunctions during those 45 rounds, and they were a combination of failure to feeds and failure to ejects. But as soon as I started using the Aguila, it ran flawlessly. Even though both of these ammos fall within the recommended range for the ammo on this pistol, which is 1050 to 1150 feet per second, from my personal experience, the Aguila, which is 1130, would probably be the lowest velocity ammo that I run in this gun. One note that I will make here is that loading that subsonic round in my magazines first worked like a charm. I did not dry fire onto an empty chamber one time during this second range trip. Alright, now I'm going to move on and start comparing some of the wear that's on this 1050 round gun to some of the new parts that haven't been used yet. I have to say, all in all, it doesn't look terrible. I've seen a lot worse on guns that cost a lot more. The wear spot that sticks out the most to me is the divot that's starting in the hammer. That's not something I've seen before. In my mind, it doesn't seem typical, and I can definitely see how that's going to be an issue down the road. The second thing that I'm going to mention is the compression of the recoil spring. And I actually think this is extremely typical and totally expected. I only mention it because visually it's the second most obvious wear spot that you can see. To a lesser extent, you can see a little bit of metal displacement around the disconnector pocket on the slide. I actually don't think this is a concern. I thought I'd just mention it just because it's noticeable. I did end up removing the firing pin and measuring it against the new unused one, and there was only a fraction of a millimeter difference, so I'm going to say that that wasn't an issue. All the other wear that I see on the slide and frame where the slide and the rails are making contact and the hammers interfacing with the back plate of the slide seem to be totally typical to me. The research that I did on this firearm before I purchased it indicated that the wear that I'm seeing now on this was going to be inevitable. So it doesn't surprise me at all to see the wear that I'm seeing on this gun after 1,000 rounds. This firearm is going to have a fairly specific role in my collection. I'm going to be using it to teach new shooters that might be recoil sensitive. The fact that the parts for this gun are so inexpensive and this firearm is going to be fairly easy to work on, I can see it lasting a very long time. One thing that I failed to mention earlier was that throughout my research into this gun, I have heard nothing but good things about Phoenix Arms customer service. So that is definitely another plus for this firearm. I feel like that company will go out of their way to help you. Alright, so my final thoughts on the Phoenix Arms HP22A. I think it's really hard to go wrong with this little gun, especially for the price point. I think that a little bit of knowledge goes a long way with this firearm. If you take some precautions with the dry firing and plan ahead a little with some replacement parts, I think this gun can be really useful and last for a very long time. That is going to conclude my content on the Phoenix Arms HP22A. I hope someone out there got something from it. Feel free to leave your questions and comments. Stay safe and God bless.